The stagecoach lurched, throwing Ilara against the worn leather strap she clung to. Dust, fine as milled flour, coated everything: her threadbare dress, the patched carpet-bag at her feet, the very air she breathed. It had been a constant companion for weeks, a gritty reminder of how far she'd traveled from the damp, green familiarity of her past towards an unknown future in a place called Redemption Creek. The name itself felt like a prayer she hadn't dared to voice, heat pressed down, relentless and smothering, even through the coach's grimy window. Ilara squinted at the landscape blurring past: sun-baked earth, skeletal shrubs, distant hazy mountains that seemed to ripple under the fierce sun. It was a world stripped bare, unforgiving. A knot of apprehension, tight for days, cinched itself further in her chest. What had she done, wagering her last hopes on a stranger's brief, practical letter and a smudged photograph? The letter had promised a new life, a home. Silas Blackwood, her correspondent, owned the mercantile in Redemption Creek. He sought a wife, plain and hard-working, he'd written. Ilara had thought herself both. Her plainness, she'd believed, was an asset here. At home, her face, liberally dusted with freckles across her nose and cheeks, had been a source of small, persistent miseries. Sun-kissed by a hailstorm, her aunt used to titter. Ilara hoped, in this new, rugged land, such trivialities wouldn't matter. The coach groaned to a halt. Redemption Creek, the driver rasped, his voice as dry as the trail. Ilara gathered her meager courage and stepped down, her legs stiff and unsteady. The town was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by a handful of weathered wooden buildings, a saloon, a blacksmith's forge that rang with the clang of hammer on metal, a land office, and, dominating one side, Blackwood's mercantile, sundries. A man emerged from the mercantile, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He was stout, with a florid face and small, assessing eyes. Silas Blackwood. He scanned the disembarking passengers, his gaze snagging on Ilara. He approached, his boots kicking up little puffs of ochre dust. "Miss Ilara Vance?" he asked, his voice louder than his letters had suggested. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood." Her own voice was a whisper, lost in the immense dry air. He looked her up and down, a slow, deliberate appraisal that made her skin crawl. His eyes, small and shrewd, lingered on her face, and a frown creased his brow. He grunted, a sound of dissatisfaction. The photograph didn't quite show the extent of it. "The extent," Ilara murmured, her hand instinctively rising towards her cheek. "The spots," he said bluntly, "like a turkey egg." A few onlookers, loitering on the boardwalk, snickered. Heat, sharper than the sun's, flooded Ilara's face. The old shame, familiar and stinging, coiled in her stomach. So, even here, in this desolate place, it mattered. I am a hard worker, Mr. Blackwood," she managed, her voice trembling slightly. "As I wrote." "Hard work's one thing," he said, still frowning. "A man expects a wife to be presentable, not look like she's caught some pox." More laughter, louder this time, from a woman with a pinched face peering from the doorway of a small eatery. Ilara's hope, a fragile seedling nurtured across lonely miles, withered. Her eyes felt hollow. Silas Blackwood puffed out his chest. "Truth is, Miss Vance, I've had second thoughts. A man in my position, a store owner, appearances count." He gestured dismissively. "You ain't quite what I was bargaining for." The words, brutal and public, struck Ilara like a physical blow. Abandoned. Again, the stagecoach driver was already unstrapping her trunk, dumping it beside her carpet bag in the dust. The coach would be leaving soon, back the way it came, but she had no money for the return passage, nowhere to return to. "But your letter," she stammered, clutching the worn fabric of her bag. You paid my passage. Consider it a bad investment, Blackwood said, turning away. Town's got no place for you, I reckon. Best you move on. He retreated into the cool dimness of his store, the door thudding shut behind him like a final judgment. Ilara stood alone on the dusty street, the laughter of the onlookers fading into curious stares. The sun beat down, the dust settled. Redemption Creek, it offered her none. Her journey had ended here, in humiliation, under a sky as vast and indifferent as the barren land stretching in every direction. The few coins in her reticule wouldn't last a night. The taste of despair was metallic in her mouth, as bitter as the alkali dust. She sank onto her small trunk, the heat of the wood seeping through her thin dress. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. Crying wouldn't change the stark reality of her situation. She was a stranger, unwanted, with nowhere to go. The desolation of the landscape mirrored the emptiness inside her. From the saloon, a tinny piano churned out a mocking tune. A shadow fell over her. Ilara flinched, expecting more scorn. She looked up into a pair of steady, dark eyes set in a sun-weathered face. The man was tall and lean, dressed in worn denims and a faded blue shirt. A cowboy, by the look of his dusty hat and the way he stood, relaxed but alert. He wasn't smiling, nor was he sneering. His expression was unreadable, but there was no malice in it. He just looked at her, a long, considering gaze that, unlike Blackwood's, didn't make her feel like a flawed commodity. He took in her tear-bright eyes, her freckled face, the slump of her shoulders. "Trouble, ma'am?" His voice was low, a little rough, like stones in a creek bed. Ilara swallowed, finding it hard to speak past the lump in her throat. "Mr. Blackwood, he doesn't want me." The admission felt like another lash. The cowboy's gaze flickered towards the mercantile, then back to her. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Heard some of it. Blackwood's got a mouth bigger than his sense. He paused. "Name's Caleb Yates." "Ilara Vance." He nodded. The silence stretched, filled only by the buzzing of unseen insects and the distant clang from the smithy. Ilara waited, expecting him to walk away, to leave her to her fate. Most would. "Reckon you need a place to stay the night," he said finally, more a statement than a question. "Boardin' house ain't likely to take you without funds," and Martha Pringle, he inclined his head towards the eatery. She follows Blackwood's lead. Ilara's shoulders sagged. "I don't know what to do." Caleb Yates rubbed the back of his neck. He looked uncomfortable, as if kindness were an ill-fitting garment. "Got a ranch, few miles out. Always need an extra hand. Cookin', mendin', nothing fancy. It's quiet." Ilara stared at him, suspicion warring with a desperate flicker of hope. Why would he help her, a stranger? Was this another kind of trap? But his eyes, though guarded, seemed honest. There was a stillness about him, a rootedness that felt different from Blackwood's bluster or the town's careless cruelty. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He shrugged, looking out at the horizon. "Don't hold with leaving folks stranded. Ain't right." He shifted his weight. "It's a fair offer. Roof and meals for honest work. Nothing more, nothing less." She looked at her trunk, at the hostile street, at the unforgiving sun. She had no other choices. I can cook, and I'm a good mender." "All right then." He bent and easily lifted her trunk, settling it on one shoulder. "Wagon's over by the livery. We can load your things." As she followed him, her small carpet bag clutched in her hand, Ilara didn't dare to feel relief. It was a reprieve, perhaps, not a rescue. But as she walked away from the heart of Redemption Creek, she felt the weight of the town's judgment lift, just a fraction. The heat still pressed, the dust still rose, but she was moving, not stranded. Caleb Yates didn't speak much as they loaded her belongings onto a sturdy buckboard wagon. His movements were economical, efficient. The journey to his ranch was made mostly in silence. The wagon creaked, the horses' hooves clopped rhythmically, and the vast landscape unrolled around them. It was still harsh, still challenging, but seen from the seat beside Caleb Yates, it felt less threatening. He seemed a part of it, weathered and resilient like the stubborn mesquite trees. His ranch was a small, raw-boned affair, a sturdy log cabin, a corral, a barn, and a scattering of outbuildings, all nestled in a shallow dip that offered some protection from the wind. It wasn't grand, but it was solid, built with care. A lone cottonwood tree stood near the cabin, its leaves whispering in the faint breeze. "This is it," Caleb said, pulling the horses to a halt. "The cabin's small. You can have the loft room. It's private." Ilara nodded, her throat too tight for words. He helped her down, then unloaded her trunk. As he carried it towards the cabin, she took a deep breath. The air here, away from the town's confinement, smelled of dust, yes, but also of dry grass, horse, and something else, something clean and wild. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A curtained-off area suggested Caleb's sleeping quarters. A steep ladder led to the loft. "Water's from the well," he said, gesturing outside. "Got a small vegetable patch out back if you've a mind for it. Evenings are yours once the chores are done." He set her trunk down at the foot of the ladder. "I'll see to the horses." And then he was gone, leaving Ilara alone in the quiet space. She climbed the ladder to the loft. It was small, tucked under the eaves, with a single shuttered window and a straw-filled mattress on a simple frame. It was more than she'd had an hour ago. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs creaking. The silence of the place was profound, broken only by the sigh of the wind outside and the distant nicker of a horse. She was safe, for now. She had a roof over her head, the promise of food and work. It was a fragile hold on existence, but it was something. Days settled into a routine. Ilara rose before dawn, started the fire, prepared breakfast, usually coffee, bacon, and biscuits. Caleb ate with few words, his dark eyes often distant, looking out the window as if gauging the day. Then he'd be gone, working his land, tending his few cattle. Ilara would clean, mend his worn clothes, each stitch a small act of gratitude, a quiet assertion of her worth. She swept the packed earth yard, drew water, and, as the weeks passed, began to coax life from the stubborn soil of the vegetable patch Caleb had mentioned. Her hands, unused to such labor, became calloused and sore, but there was a satisfaction in the ache. She learned the language of Caleb's silences. A slight nod meant approval. A deepening of the lines around his eyes meant worry about the lack of rain. He rarely spoke of himself, and Ilara, mindful of her precarious position, never pried. She, too, kept her past locked away. The hurt from Blackwood's rejection was a dull ache, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. The town of Redemption Creek felt a world away, though it was only a few miles. Caleb seldom went, and Ilara had no desire to return. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, after the simple supper, she would sit on the cabin step, watching the sky bleed into fiery oranges and deep purples. Caleb would often be nearby, mending tack or simply sitting, smoking his pipe, the scent of tobacco a surprisingly comforting aroma. They rarely spoke, but the shared silence was not uncomfortable. It was a space where 2 solitary people could exist without demand. One evening, a dust storm had blown through, leaving the air thick and gritty. Elara had struggled to keep the fine particles from coating the food, from seeping into every crevice of the cabin. She felt weary, discouraged, her hair clinging to her damp forehead, her face, she knew, smudged with dust that clung to her freckles, making them stand out more than usual. She served Caleb his meal, her movements heavy. He ate slowly, his gaze on her. When he finished, he didn't rise immediately. "You work hard, Elara," he said, his voice quiet. She looked up, surprised. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her. "I try to earn my keep, Mr. Yates." "Caleb," he corrected gently. He paused then. "Those marks on your face. Blackwood's a fool." Elara flinched, color rising in her cheeks. She'd almost forgotten, in the insular world of the ranch, the sting of that particular shame. She looked down at her hands, twisting her apron. "They're just freckles." He was silent for a long moment. She risked a glance at him. He was looking at her, his expression serious, almost thoughtful. "When I was a boy," he said, his voice softer now, a low rumble, "out on the range at night. Sometimes the stars were so thick, they looked like someone had scattered dust across the sky. Millions of 'em, made the darkness beautiful." He met her eyes directly. "They ain't just spots, Elara. They're like a constellation. Close up." Elara stared at him, speechless. No one had ever said anything like that to her. Never. Stars. He saw stars where others saw blemishes, flaws. A warmth spread through her chest, unfamiliar and powerful, pushing back the chill of old hurts. It wasn't a compliment designed to flatter. It was an observation, quiet and sincere, from a man who rarely wasted words. For the first time, she didn't feel the urge to hide her face. A small, hesitant smile touched her lips. "Thank you, Caleb." He just nodded, then rose and went outside, leaving Elara with the echo of his words and a feeling she couldn't quite name, but it felt a lot like hope. The fragile piece of their existence was shattered a few weeks later. Caleb had ridden into Redemption Creek for supplies, a trip he made as infrequently as possible. Elara was tending the small garden, her hands covered in soil, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching, not from the direction of the town, but from a side trail. Silas Blackwood reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, his bulk seeming to cast a pall over the sunlit space. A sneer played on his lips as he surveyed the modest improvements Elara had made, the neatly weeded garden, the swept yard, the mended curtains in the cabin window. "Well, well," he said, his voice oily. "Made yourself quite at home, haven't you, Miss Vance?" Elara straightened, her heart thudding. She wiped her hands on her apron, trying to project a calmness she didn't feel. "Mr. Blackwood, what do you want?" "Heard Yates took you in. Charity case, are you?" His eyes roamed over her, lingering again on her face. "Still speckled as ever, I see. Though I reckon the sun out here's only made it worse." "Caleb offered me honest work," Elara said, her voice firmer than she expected, "which is more than can be said for some." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Don't get uppity with me, girl. Fact is, I paid your passage here. That makes you indebted to me. Maybe I've reconsidered. A woman to cook and clean at the mercantile, even one like you, might be useful. Yates can't pay you what I can." The implication was clear. He saw her as property, something he could claim or discard at will. The memory of his public rejection, the humiliation, burned fresh. "I am not indebted to you for your cruelty, Mr. Blackwood," Elara said, her chin rising, "and I am not for sale." His face darkened. "You're a mail-order bride who didn't take. You've got no standing here, no protector." He smirked. "Unless you think Yates fancies himself that." Before Elara could respond, another sound reached them, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Caleb emerged from the cottonwoods lining the creek bed, his rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. He'd clearly circled around, approaching unseen. His face was grim, his eyes cold as chips of flint as they settled on Blackwood. "She said she's not interested, Blackwood." Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. "Time for you to leave my property." Blackwood, startled, straightened in his saddle. He hadn't expected Caleb's return so soon, nor his silent approach. "Yates, this ain't your concern. This is between me and the girl. Anything concerning Miss Vance on this land is my concern," Caleb stated, dismounting smoothly. He didn't raise his voice, but there was an unmistakable authority in his tone, a bedrock strength that made Blackwood's bluster seem hollow. "She's under my protection." Blackwood sneered, trying to regain his composure. "Protect in what? A freckled reject? You lowering your standards, Yates? Or just desperate for any female company?" Elara felt a surge of anger, sharp and clean, on Caleb's behalf as much as her own. But before she could speak, Caleb took a slow step forward. "I told you once before, Blackwood, you're a fool." His gaze flicked to Elara, a softness entering his eyes for a fleeting second before hardening again on Silas. "Some men look at a field of wildflowers and just see weeds. Others see beauty that most folks are too blind to notice. These Freckles you scorn." He gestured towards Elara. "They're more like stars than spots, and it takes a man of character, not a puffed-up bully, to appreciate a clear night sky." The words hung in the air. Blackwood's face flushed a dark, mottled red. He was clearly incensed, but Caleb's quiet intensity, the rifle held loosely but ready, gave him pause. He looked from Caleb's unyielding stance to Elara, who stood straighter now, her earlier fear replaced by a fierce, protective loyalty. She wasn't just a charity case, she was defended, valued. "You'll regret this, Yates," Blackwood snarled, yanking on his horse's reins. "Both of you." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, kicking up a cloud of angry dust that slowly settled in his wake. Silence descended, heavy and charged. Elara let out a shaky breath. She turned to Caleb, her heart full. "Thank you," she whispered. He had no right." Caleb's expression softened as he looked at her. He leaned his rifle against the cabin wall. No, he didn't. He met her gaze, his own dark eyes holding a warmth that chased away the last of the shadows Blackwood had cast. "What I said about the stars, I meant it, Elara." A genuine smile, wide and radiant, lit Elara's face. The sun caught the myriad of tiny markings on her skin, and for the first time she didn't feel shame, only a reflection of the light Caleb saw in her. "I know you did, Caleb." The incident with Blackwood, though unsettling, had changed something fundamental. It had brought unspoken feelings into the open, solidifying the bond between them. Caleb's defense of her, his public affirmation of her worth in the face of Blackwood's scorn, had been more than just a kind gesture. It was a declaration. Life on the ranch continued, but the quiet companionship between Elara and Caleb deepened into something more tender, more profound. The silences were still comfortable, but now they were often punctuated by shared smiles, by small, thoughtful gestures. Elara found herself humming as she worked, the harsh landscape no longer feeling quite so alien. It was becoming home, a place where she was seen, truly seen, for who she was. One cool evening, months later, Elara stood by the cabin window, looking out at the vast, darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to prick the deep indigo. She touched her cheek, a light, unconscious gesture. The freckles were still there, a permanent part of her, but they no longer felt like flaws. Caleb came to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. He followed her gaze to the heavens. "Sky'll be clear tonight," he observed. "Good for seeing 'em." Ilara turned to him, her eyes shining in the dim light from the lamp. "They are beautiful, aren't they?" she said softly, and it wasn't just the celestial bodies she was talking about. Caleb's hand found hers, his calloused fingers lacing through her own. His touch was gentle, sure. "They are, Ilara," he agreed, his gaze holding hers. "Every single one." In the quiet solitude of the small ranch, under a canopy of distant stars, Ilara Vance, the mail-order bride once teased for her freckles, had found her place. She had discovered her own resilience, her own worth, reflected in the eyes of a quiet cowboy who had looked past the surface and seen the constellations within. Redemption Creek had offered her nothing, but here, in the heart of the unforgiving frontier, with Caleb by her side, she had found her own redemption, her own new beginning, as bright and boundless as the starry sky above. The heat of the land no longer felt oppressive. It was simply a part of the life they were building, a life earned, a life shared. And it was good. Optional YouTube CTA suggestion, if this were a script for that platform. If Ilara and Caleb's story of resilience and unexpected connection touched your heart, let us know in the comments below. Sometimes seeing the beauty others miss can change a life. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales from the frontier, where courage and kindness can blossom in the harshest of lands. And remember, true worth shines brighter than any prejudice.